I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Sarita Samaroo is a lawyer that runs a law firm, SST Law, that specializes in financing of real estate, particularly residential real estate. Given what's going on in the housing market, we've talked to mortgage brokers, we've talked to developers, we've talked to economists. People are saying that foreclosures, powers of sale are up, delinquencies are up. 60% of all the mortgages in Canada are going to renew in the next year and a half at higher rates. I thought it would be good to talk to an expert of what's actually going on in the marketplace and how desperate are people, and is this calamity or this crisis or this bust that people are talking about actually happening on the street. So Sarita Samaroo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So let's talk about some of these things. So powers of sale, I understand, have gone from 5 a month to 500 a month. And that's, like someone told me, 5 to 6 months old data, because it takes you 5 or 6 months to get through the court process to actually get a power of sale. And so this person was suggesting it's going to be dramatically more than 500 right now once the data comes out. Mortgage delinquencies are a 30-year high. Starts are down. 60% of mortgages are going to renew at higher rates in the next year and a half. Condo values are down 30%, maybe more. What are you seeing?
Funny enough, I am seeing a lot more of my clients purchasing by way of power of sale. So I'm not necessarily always on the lender side, but I am seeing that our clients are purchasing power of sales, and they're coming in at a much faster rate than previously. In the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of defaults. I've had to conduct a lot of negotiations for clients in order to get their equity and amounts owing down to zero, essentially. It's been awful in that sense. So we have seen a lot of the first-time home buyers jumping into the market and attempting to purchase these powers of sale. But the issue with the power of sales is that the borrower always has something called the equity of redemption, which means that they have the right at any point in time to redeem the mortgage. Even if there's what we call a writ of possession, whereby a sheriff has gone in, taken possession, and evicted the borrower. So that being said, when I'm advising and reviewing these files, I do advise my clients to carefully weigh this out. If they're purchasing a power of sale property, while it may look like a great investment, you are purchasing the property on an as-is, where-is basis. And often the lenders put in provisions into what we call their Schedule B, whereby they try to opt out of tax arrears, any title issues, any outstanding open permits or work orders. So there is an inherent risk with purchasing these properties. That being said, that's why it's always crucial to have a lawyer review the documents carefully and put it subject to solicitor review. But that being said, we are seeing a lot more of them come in more frequently. So we are.
Wow, this is interesting. So let's go through this step by step if we could. So how does one become aware of a power of sale? Are there specific websites or agents or places that focus on powers of sale versus just typical properties?
So, initially it always used to be, you'd see estate sales were the deal. But in this type of market that we're in, it's a power of sales where you find a quote unquote deal. So it's the realtors hunting for their respective clients to find these deals. And it will say specifically in the listing that it is by way of a power of sale. So it's more of a luck of the draw. Sometimes you will catch wind that you'll see an eviction notice. You might live on the street, you might be a neighbor, you might see the eviction notice posted, sadly, on the door. So you may catch wind of it and put in an offer, preemptively approach the lender. So you can approach the lender ahead of time to say, hey, I'm interested in this property. I noticed there's an eviction notice. Can I put in an offer before you put it up for sale? And even initiate a private sale. So it's really just like the draw. The realtors are finding the listings. But ultimately, if you do see one and see a notice on the door, a lot of clients tend to capitalize on it.
Okay, so then you found a house that is subject to a power of sale, so that please correct me if I'm wrong, the lender is actually now the vendor, not the original owner.
Correct. Yes, the vendor is the owner. So they now have judgment against the borrower. From there, just because you have a judgment, you have to now enforce a judgment, and that's by writ of possession, seizure, and sale. And a sheriff goes in to evict the families. They do have to wait till the property is completely vacant. So sometimes they'll be sitting in their car, hovering, waiting for the parties to leave their home. Then they would go in, change the locks, and then from there they take possession. If there's tenancies in there, then the tenants have to be notified. There was a commercial plaza my client recently leased, and all the tenants were notified that the landlord was in default of their mortgage. So they take over the leases by way of something called a notice of assignment of rents that gets registered on the title to the property. And when that happens, that gives the ability of the lender to collect the rents from the tenants. Otherwise it would be illegal. So that's why it's very important when we're arranging mortgages for lenders, when we act on the lender side, that they're protected, but as well, we have to ensure that there's that ability as well to enter the premises and collect from tenants that are on the premises as well.
Okay, but let's go back to a single family home or a principal residence. If you're buying it, you say it's as is where is. Can you explain what that means? Most people think that you're going to get an inspection, an appraisal. You're going to get to tour the site. Someone has staged the house, etc. It's very different with the power of sale, is it not?
Correct, yes. So with the power of sale, typically there is in the listings attached something called a Schedule B. And the realtors put a condition in so that the offer is subject to solicitor review. And at that point, we have a look at it and re-review it. And as I mentioned, we've had several of those come to us recently. And in there, it talks about that the state of the property, the chattels and the fixtures, so the fridge, stove, washer, dryer, whatever is in the property, even the actual damage to the property, if there's any holes in the wall, if there's any specific damage to the property, there is an acceptance on an as is where is basis. Often where you can dispute with the lender is where they say, well, you're accepting the property with open permits, work orders. That's where, as lawyers for the purchasers, we push back a little bit and say, no, we can't accept title in that manner, because some case law states that it goes to the root of title, that if there's a work order against a property, that affects title. Same with tax arrears. Tax arrears are a tax lien, construction lien. Often the lenders try to opt out of those scenarios, but again, that's unacceptable. As a purchaser's lawyer, I would be arguing that unfortunately that has to be removed, those clauses. And so we review that very carefully to ensure the purchaser is protected, but often the lenders do try to opt out of any responsibility or liability as related to the property.
So, in my experience, these powers of sale, there are often tax arrears because the lender doesn't want to put a lot of money into maintaining the house, and so therefore utility bills may not be paid, tax payments may not be paid. That often the house just looks terrible because it wasn't, the lawn wasn't cut, the building, the house wasn't, kept up. Is that a negative or is that a positive? The negative would be it looks terrible, but the positive would be because it looks terrible, there aren't a lot of other potential bidders.
Correct. It looks terrible, and likely you're getting a deal on the property, right? So this is where purchasers see it. Well, I'm getting a heavily discounted price because I now have to maintain this property and bring it up to standard. But where is the deal breaker for us as solicitors when we're reviewing the offer? And what we tell our clients is, you can't accept title as is. And that's where that's unacceptable, because then you should not take on tax arrears, open permits, open work orders by a municipality. So that is where, typically we push back with the lenders, although in their standard Schedule B, that's what it states. Chattels, though, you do accept on an as is or
So,
as basis.
your sense, are powers of sale up dramatically?
They are. Yes, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg. But we
The
were
tip of the iceberg. So you think it's going to get even worse?
Yes, I think so. I think we're just at the point where when parties purchased, when the market was high in 2022 was really the peak of the market. At that point, people were overpaying for their properties. So we have properties where what we call the loan to value ratio is significantly high, such as 90%, meaning that they've overextended their mortgages. They may have a first or a second that are whereby they only have 10% equity in the property and it's mortgaged to the hills. So, and that's not necessarily the fault of the client, because now the properties come down underappraised. So we've had scenarios in which our clients can't even refinance because no bank will look at them. They want to see at least 20% equity within the property. And there's 90% loan to value, only 10% equity. So they have to sell. Clients are forced to sell, and it just gives them enough to pay for real estate commission and legal fees, if that. And
So
often.
So let's talk about this for a second. So this is 60% of all the mortgages that are in Canada today are coming due within the next year and a half, and interest rates are higher, so the mortgage payment's going to go up. But in addition to refinance, a lot of them are going to need to get new appraisals to prove that the house value is in excess of the mortgage. And what you're saying is that you think some of them aren't going to be able to get refinance. Is that correct?
Oh, correct. It's already happening. It's already happening in the sense that they're not getting refinanced. And so clients are forced to sell, downsize, which ultimately I believe is the goal of the federal government. I mean, it's opening up the market to first-time home buyers is what they were looking to do, and then cool off the housing market. They've achieved their goal. So, because unfortunately people cannot sustain their mortgage or their mortgage payment, sadly. And as I mentioned previously, we are often negotiating down lenders and prorating what is available to any lender or unsecured creditor that's owed funds. So if there's a court judgment against an individual, that's an unsecured debt typically, and there's a writ against them, we have to now negotiate pro rata sharing of that debt, whatever equity is available. And so I have found myself in the past 2 years negotiating to get everything down to zero, just so that people aren't stuck with having to bring in money to my office to pay off those debts or those mortgages, which has
Okay,
been.
so this is interesting. Please explain this a little bit more slowly to everybody. So someone's house is not much in excess of the mortgage, and they've got other debts, and what you say that there's a court order. Tell me what the process is here. So they
Yes.
haven't
So
declared bankruptcy yet, but they're effectively bankrupt or close to bankrupt. Is that the case?
yes and no. I mean, ultimately, what has happened is they have secured debt, which are the mortgages. So let's say they have a first, a second, even a third mortgage. Then they have unsecured debt, which is credit card debt, is what we know it as typically, and they haven't paid that. And so therefore, those creditors now have gone to court to get a judgment against them. And then, in order, as I said, to enforce a judgment, you have to get a writ. So, a writ is filed in the municipality where they live. As an example, let's say it's Peel Region, which is Mississauga. They file that writ. And then what ends up happening is when they go to sell their property, we pull all of these title searches. The other lawyer that's purchasing will pull these title searches. We'll pull them as well on the sale side, and we'll discover this unsecured debt. We cannot close by simply paying off the mortgages. We have to pay out that unsecured debt because there's a court judgment against that party, even though it's unsecured debt and falls in last priority to the secured debt. We still have to ensure that the party receiving title gets clear and free title. That is our job as real estate lawyers. So, in that sense, what we have to do is say what is available after payout of real estate commission. And sometimes we see things like CRA liens, which is super priority over mortgages, super priority liens, which is, the federal government has priority over even the mortgage companies. So we then have to ensure CRA is paid. Then we have to ensure that the mortgage companies are paid. And then whatever's remaining goes to the unsecured creditor. But a lot of times these unsecured creditors say, no, we want a pro rata sharing, even though we're last in line. We would like to ensure that after CRA, which is number one, of course, because of their super priority, that the mortgagee shares in some of the debt that is owed to us and therefore get the debt down to zero. So we have to get a pre-approval as lawyers of how the pro rata sharing is to all of the creditors, whether they're secured or unsecured. And then if
And do
they
the secured creditors, the mortgagees, the mortgage providers, do they accept that because they're going to get less debt and less payout than they deserve?
Most of them do. Most of them do. Most of them are reasonable because, especially if they're second priority, same with the unsecured creditors, if they're last in line, they will accept something. Something is better than nothing. Because otherwise, you're chasing someone that has no assets after the fact and spending money on legal fees, essentially funds on legal fees. So that is why they prefer a lawyer reach out to them and say, we'd like to settle this debt on behalf of the client, but as a real estate solicitor, I've also become a debt negotiator, which, I ironically enough, that's typically not part of my job as part of, a closing, but that has become my job in the past couple of years.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. We're going to talk about delinquencies. We're going to talk about renegotiation. We're going to talk about how bad the market is and people that have invested in condos and what happens when the condo's completed and you gotta come to the table and make that final payment. Stay with us, everyone. This will be a practical conversation today about how the current real estate market is impacting people's lives and their financial situation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got a lawyer that specializes in home real estate, Sarita Samaroo of SST Law, with us tonight. And we're going to talk through some of the realities, the personal realities of the real estate market today. So we've talked about powers of sale. We've talked about sort of your debt negotiations. I want to talk about delinquencies because I think a lot of people are talking about delinquencies going up dramatically. And so what happens here? So this is not yet into a power of sale. And someone, comes to you and says, the bank is after me because I'm delinquent in my mortgage payments. What do you do then?
So if they approach me ahead of time, we can request something called a payout statement. And with the payout statement, we can now ask the bank to cease from commencing enforcement action. If we address this ahead of time, there's greater room for negotiation for the parties. So we always recommend don't leave it to the 11th hour. Also, if it's beyond our scope, we refer it out to a litigation lawyer. But that being said, often as real estate lawyers, we are able to nip it in the bud, essentially, and try to assist in this regard. But if you leave it too late, again, it's a little bit more difficult. And a lot of people just say, I'll just let it go into default, let everything go into default, and then deal with it at the end. But you may run into a creditor that's not willing to negotiate. You may run into a mortgagee that says, I want to be repaid in full. So they have to come up with the shortfall if there is a shortfall and not enough equity within the property. But often creditors have been in this type of market quite reasonable with the negotiations and writing off certain debt and just having to now explain that to their investors, unfortunately.
So my understanding is that delinquencies are up dramatically. Is that also your sense based on how many people are coming into your office?
Correct. Yes, absolutely. They are up. We've seen it increase in the past year, sadly. And, what I always say to clients is let's try to work out a negotiation ahead of time with the lenders. And if that's not possible, look to sell and downsize if that's a possibility. Don't hold on to your property hoping the market will increase and that the property values will increase. That will happen slowly over time. I mean, there was a statistic last month with TREB with the prices, the values have increased and the sales have increased by 8.5%. The sales have increased. So that's a good sign. But again, we've only seen that relief come recently with, a 0.25% drop in the interest rates. We're hoping by November the rates will decrease again. But that being said, there's no guarantee. There's no promise for tomorrow. So try to address the situation as early as possible. Don't fall into delinquency, eviction, and run into a scenario where you're trying to evade the creditor. Just work with us. That's our job, and we can assist you.
And the banks, the mortgage holders typically are willing to negotiate?
They are. They are. I mean, really, they've been flexible. Surprisingly, we have seen that they understand their priority, especially if they're in lower priority to, say, a CRA lien that's registered on the title to someone's property, which is always a super priority lien. Same with construction lien holders. If there is a contractor that's left unpaid, they're in super priority to a lender. So that being said, they understand their level of priority. They understand sometimes there has to be what we call a pro rata sharing of the debt, and that's spread amongst everyone. So everyone gets something, and not that one person walks away with everything. There's been a lot more flexibility and understanding given the current market scenario.
I understand there's a big issue with people closing condos. So let's talk about this for a couple minutes if we could. So, lots of people invested in pre-construction condos a couple years ago, and typically, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, you put down 5% or 10%, then you had to come back and put down another 5% after a certain leg of time, and then maybe you're in for like 15% or 20% total deposits prior to completion. And your plan was that you were going to flip it or sell it or do something with it before you had to make that final big payment upon closing an occupancy. But now the values are down, and you had this appraisal from a couple years ago that said that the value was far in excess of your debt. You got a potential for a mortgage, but now you're struggling because the values are down. You can't get an appraisal that's big enough. What happens?
So there's a few options, is what I always tell my clients. The first option would be approach the builder to see if you can assign the unit to a third party. Assignment means that before you close, before you even get to what we call the two-stage closing, the occupancy closing and the final closing, which is what is pre-construction condos, as an example, is what has to take place. You may have a clause within your agreement of purchase and sale which says that you can sell it to a third party. And if you have that ability to do so, you engage a realtor that can find that third party buyer for you. Often it cannot be listed on MLS. There's restrictions within the agreement of purchase and sale. You find that third party buyer. If you're lucky enough, you can get a premium on the purchase price. But in this type of market, what I've seen in the past year is that people are taking losses. So in the sense that you've given, let's say, Brian, $100,000 deposit, you may have to shave off 20,000 of that deposit so as to lower the purchase price to sell to a third party buyer to be in line with the current market appraisal of that property. So that is what you would do. You would sell it ahead of time. But let's say you can't find a third party buyer. Then what do? Now you're forced to close. So you can put in a tenant. You can get permission of the builder to put in a tenant during what we call the occupancy closing, which is where you pay almost like a rent to the builder while the building is being registered. And then you move what we call to the second stage called final closing, which is when you have to have your mortgage. So you can put in a tenant during the occupancy phase, get permission of the builder to do so, and that will help cover that cost of what we call that occupancy fee, which comprises of the unpaid balance of the purchase price multiplied by a 1-year Bank of Canada fixed rate interest rate mortgage, maintenance fees, and land taxes. So that's what the builder gets as a bonus, and that doesn't get applied towards your down payment, unfortunately. That goes strictly to the builder for their construction costs. And so that occupancy fee, if the builder permits it, it will allow you to put in a tenant to cover that cost. And in that time, you can see if hopefully you can get a mortgage and that the appraisal comes in. Now, what happens if you get to the final closing stage and the appraisal comes in low? What do? Because now you've overpaid for this property. You can't close because no one will give you a mortgage. So what my suggestion to my clients is, typically with these developments, There is a bank that has secured the financing over the whole development. So I typically recommend that you approach the lender that provided the financing over the development as a whole and ask for a mortgage because they will maintain their value for that developer. And if you're able to get a mortgage through that original lender that gave the mortgage to the developer, typically they will provide the financing because they don't want to see the lender go into, rather the developer go into default of their own mortgage. So this is what I recommend. Those are the steps in which I tell my clients to take. But if all else fails, then yes, you have to engage a litigation lawyer to try to attempt to get your deposits back or a portion thereof and to be released from the deal. And what I've seen in my experience is my clients have received, sometimes on occasion, the deposit returned, only a very small percentage of the deposit, maybe 10% of the deposit returned if the developer is being generous. But a lot of times the deposits are forfeited and then they will pursue that client for the difference owed to them that they would have otherwise been entitled to. And the courts, unfortunately, the case law right now is ruling in favor of the developer.
So these people that say, well, I'll just walk away. You can't just walk away. The developer comes after you, correct?
Correct. They will get a court judgment against you. And the last thing you need is your credit affected for 7 years or to fall into bankruptcy. I always tell my clients, try to find a third-party buyer. That's your first step. If you
Now,
can't,
assignment sales
yes.
are up dramatically as well, or at least assignment sale listings are up dramatically. So is that very possible? If so many people are closing on these, sorry, not closing on these condos, but trying to sell the condos prior to closing by way of assignment, if those assignment sale listings are up dramatically, is that possible?
Yes, I mean, assignments are highly recommended. What I've seen sadly in the past year and a half is that my clients, instead of what you would normally see with an assignment, you get a gain on what you're selling and you sell your property or condo at a premium, you're actually taking a loss. So I've seen my clients that are selling these condos having to actually come up with money, which I never thought, I've never seen this in almost 15 years. I have never seen clients have to put in money. So that's an anomaly for us as real estate lawyers. But that being said, just to get out of the deal and have a third party buyer take it over, it is worth it rather than having the exercise of having to have a court judgment against you by a developer. And
And these
sadly,
and this, let's just run through for a second what will end up happening. So if you
yes.
don't sell it by way of assignment, and then closing comes and you don't show up with the cash to close and buy your condo that you contracted to buy several years ago, what's the developer going to do?
What they'll do is they will enforce their judgment. Typically, in the agreement of purchase and sale, they will forfeit the deposits, and then they will have to pursue a judgment against the party. So they'll have to go to court, and then once that judgment is received, then they can pursue it and enforce it. They can garnish your wages. They can file a writ in the municipality of where you live. Let's say this wasn't meant to be an investment property, and it'll severely affect your credit and possibly force you into bankruptcy. So this is where I tell my clients, do not do that. Do not go down that rabbit hole. If there is the possibility of finding a third party buyer or even possibly putting in a family member in there for a year, or a child or whatever the case may be, and an adult child, do it. Don't fall into the trap of just walking away and burying your head in the sand. Do not do that. There are ways out of the agreement, and there is an ability to close too. We've had clients take our suggestion, approach a developer and say, who did you use as your lender? And let's say it's the major institutional lender that secured the financing. That major financial institution will not allow the developer to go into default.
So I
And
understand that's called a blanket appraisal. So they've got an appraisal against the whole building and valued all of the different condos in that. Why is that, you know, higher and more optimistic in its valuation than the appraisals that you get one off on unit by unit.
Because at the time when the bank appraised the property on behalf of the developer, they're going to maintain that value. And that's why it's powerful to go to that institutional lender, because you can look at them and say, wait a minute, how is the developer going to pay you back if you don't appraise it at the value that is expected? And so my clients have been successful with that. And that has actually saved them on final closing, whereby they took that approach. Often you see there's guarantors added, another party that maybe is a family member has to be added. That's what I've seen. And, or they may do what we call cross collateralization, whereby they secure on another property of these borrowers just to ensure that they have equity from another place. So we do see that in that there is the ability to become creative with these deals, but it's just a matter of having the right people on your team to assist you with that. And I truly believe that you really have to understand your options very thoroughly in this type of market and be very careful about who you're approaching to assist you with that.
We're going to take a break for some messages, and when we come back, I'm going to ask Sarita about second and third mortgages and what all of this collectively means for the real estate market. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a real estate lawyer with us tonight, Sarita Samaroo of SST Law. And the reason why is I really wanted to, understand exactly how the current real estate market is impacting you and I, people, regular people, as to how we refinance our properties. What do we do with condos that we bought? What do we do with mortgages that are coming due, etc. And Sarita, I understand that there's a lot of private lending going on in the marketplace today, and a lot of people taking out second and third mortgages from private lenders because they can't get enough debt in the first mortgage to either close on a condo or refinance an existing mortgage or something like that. Is that true? And is it something that you advise?
Well, a private lender is always the last choice. And we don't recommend it unless it's an absolute need, because again, the interest rates tend to be very high. They're from private individuals that have their own private funds that are willing to assist. And what they base their mortgages on are the equity you have in the property. So not necessarily your credit score or looking at your income, but they're looking at the equity in terms of what the value of the property is. Is there enough equity? I've seen with private lenders, they have been a little bit more conservative in the past couple of years, in that they're following the guidelines typically of what a bank would follow in terms of ensuring you have at least 20% equity in your property and your what we call 80% loan to value ratio. That being said, private lenders will only look typically at the equity. And of course, if a mortgage broker is involved, they'll do their due diligence and check the credit score and the credit bureau of that individual. However, generally, is there enough equity? So if I had to institute power of sale proceedings, I could take over the property and there's enough equity to pay for all of my legal fees and everything else, and also now own this property and sell it at a profit, if possible. So that being said, there are private lenders that will lend and assist clients in a bind, where, let's say, a bank is not willing to give 80% loan to value. So the banks have also become a lot more conservative in that they're lending out 70%, 75% loan to value, meaning that you would only have 25% equity or need to have 30% equity in your property. So a lot of times clients are not prepared. They have in their mind when they purchase said, I only have 20% down payment. I don't have 30% or 25%. So how am I going to account for the remainder? So they will approach a private lender for those additional funds. But the issue is at hand is that with an institutional lender like a bank, you cannot secure secondary financing or register secondary financing on the same day. So that is another issue in itself, in that if you're looking to, let's say, go with a major institutional bank, if you are looking for extra funds, you have to put the bank on notice that you're doing that. And often that first deal will fall apart. So what are clients doing? They're obtaining all of the financing through the private lender. Then at a later date, as a temporary solution, they have this private lending solution. And at a later date, replacing that private lending with, of course, an institutional bank, or what we call a B lender, which is a credit union. So that is what people are doing to quickly close. If the banks are taking too long, because often now the approvals take about 4 to 6 months before you're officially approved. So you really have to start the process early on. Even if you're refinancing, you should be starting the process very, very early on. And so the private lending solution is a great temporary, quick, fast solution, because a private deal you can close within a week and a half, whereas the bank takes 4 to 6 months for that approval. But however, the fees are expensive. And there are lender fees, there's mortgage broker fees, and the borrower always pays the lender's, lawyers, legal fees, along with their own legal fees. So that's
And
the
the interest
caveat.
rate is higher.
And the interest rate is always higher. Yes.
What's your sense? What's a B loan or a second mortgage loan interest rate today?
We're seeing somewhere between 7% all the way up to 13% is what I've seen. And that is interest only payments. So to keep in mind, if you are buying or you are borrowing from a private individual, that is interest only. So you still owe the principal back at the end. So whatever balance you borrowed, you'll still owe the full balance, and you're only paying the interest on that loan. And then when it comes time to now pay that back, you pay the interest plus you have to pay the full principal. So you're never paying down the principal, unlike a traditional bank or an institutional lender. And that is very similar to the reverse mortgages that we're seeing, which are also something that we're seeing coming out more frequently. We're seeing a lot of, elderly people that cannot qualify, that are retired, taking out reverse mortgages. And reverse mortgages act almost in the same manner. The interest is still owed by the end, and it's accruing and accumulating. And by the end of the payment of that reverse mortgage, you now have to pay back that interest because you're not making monthly payments. So that's a different product completely, unlike a private mortgage. But we're seeing a lot of
So that's interesting. Tell me about reverse mortgages. Is it something you recommend? Is it something that there's a lot more of them occurring, and who are the providers of those reverse mortgages?
So there are a few select companies. I'd say there's about 3 out there on the market. And what's very interesting about these reverse mortgages is that although you may engage one lawyer, there's another lawyer actually required. So there's a lawyer facilitating the deal and another lawyer that's providing independent legal advice to the borrower, which is really interesting because that is not typical with mortgage lending. And then from there, what happens is you don't have to make monthly payments. You can choose to make monthly payments. There are different options. You can make monthly payments if you choose to, if there's an arrangement with the bank. However, that being said, typically in most scenarios, these are retirees and they don't have an income or sufficient income to make those monthly payments. So they take a 2-year term as an example. And by the end of it, they'll owe back that principal plus the monthly payments that have accumulated by the end. Now, a lot of times people take these reverse mortgages because they say, well, I'm not sure how much time I have, in terms of, they need it for their health care. They may have certain health issues. And so they know possibly there may not be much time left for them. So they take out these reverse mortgages just to cover their healthcare costs. Other times we see retirees taking this out because they know they're likely going to sell their home in a couple of years, but they want to enjoy the equity in their home. They'd like to help their children purchase a property, or they like vacations a little bit more frequently instead of the typical CPP that they're receiving and the OAS. So there is that ability to do that. But again, I recommend ensure that there's an end in sight for these reverse mortgages, that you have a plan in place, because if you're planning on selling in a couple of years, then it makes sense. You'd like to enjoy the equity and you would not get approved otherwise through a traditional means, through a traditional bank. But ensure you get rid of it, because I've had scenarios where I've had clients take out a reverse mortgage, then they've both suddenly passed away. And then there's a requirement, and it's written into the provisions of these reverse mortgages, that the bank is required to be repaid within 6 months of death of that individual that took out that reverse mortgage. And that's impossible to receive probate in Ontario that quickly. It's not impossible, but it's likely not going to happen that quickly. The courts generally are backed up with probate and that process. So if you take out a reverse mortgage, all of a sudden now the estate is in default of that mortgage. Because why? There's a requirement within the provisions that it has to be repaid within 6 months. So, and I've had clients and, estate trustees, formerly known as executors, now estate trustees in Ontario is the proper legal term, come to me and say, oh, I didn't know this, and I'm getting default letters. And I say to them, no, we have to deal with this immediately and advise the bank you filed for probate. So ensure that if you take out a reverse mortgage, that you have a plan in place. Like, what is really the end game of the reverse mortgage? Because really it has no end in sight, because those payments continue to accrue. And until you repay it, they'll continue to accrue until repaid.
I've also heard about lots of people doing VTBs, vendor take-back mortgages. Are you seeing that as well?
Yes, actually, that's quite common these days as well. So whereby
Do you advise it?
it's a temporary solution. I do, but I don't. So a VTB is common. Brian, you're selling me your property for $1 million. I asked you for 750,000. You're now my private lender. You're my seller and my private lender. That's what a VTB is. So we can do it, certainly, but at some point, you, Brian, would like your funds repaid to you. So I have to have an exit strategy. As long as there's an exit strategy for any type of these private loans or reverse mortgages, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But there should be an exit strategy, and that's where
The challenge I've got with VTBs is I thought I sold my house, but I didn't really, because I've got this mortgage against my own house. And so therefore, if the person doesn't pay, all I do is get my house back. So I didn't really sell the house. I may feel like I did, but I didn't really. Is that the case?
That is absolutely the case. That's exactly right. And then so that is a risk. I mean, if you have the stomach for it as a seller to be a private lender now, great. If you have no issue. But the minute that seller defaults or doesn't pay you on time, yes, it becomes an issue. So you've all of a sudden signed up for something you didn't realize you signed up for. And I've seen that happen with my clients. And then the stress of that and the angst of that. So you have to really think that through carefully. You really have to have the stomach to be a private lender if that's what you're looking to do. And
we're going to take a final break and come back with our lawyer, our real estate lawyer, giving us a lot of advice today, Sarita Samaroo, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've had, I think, a really good, thorough conversation with real estate lawyer Sarita Samaroo of SST Law today, talking about the personal realities of financing and real estate in today's market. Sarita, I got to take a step back and ask you, what you think's happening here. We've got powers of sale up from 5 a month to 500 a month. We've got delinquencies up. We've got 60% of the mortgages in Canada coming due and having to be refinanced in the next year and a half. We've got the biggest delivery of pre-construction condos actually finally being delivered in 2025 in history. Real estate prices, you saying are up, but I think lots of people are saying they're down. Sales may be a little bit up, but they're up from where they were a couple months ago, down dramatically from where they were a couple of years ago. I hear about Green Park that are selling out townhouses at like 60%, 50% of what they thought they were worth a year or two ago. What's happening?
What's happening is the federal government had a stronghold on the market for too long. And I think that the issue is that, unfortunately, we didn't see this coming. We really didn't. It was unpredictable. I mean, we were riding on some good waves in COVID where the interest rates were significantly low. I remember you and I met during COVID, and it was just too good to be true. 1.5%, 1.3% variable rates. Then there were parties that had to sustain those mortgages in that time. So the variable rate went from 1.3 to 1.5 to all the way up to 6 to 7%. And really, that was unsustainable. It really was, in the sense that you didn't sign up for that. You purchased a property at the peak of the market where the value was at its highest. Then you were paying these very low interest rates. All of a sudden, you're paying very high interest rates. Now you're in a market today, unfortunately, whereby your home is not at the value you purchased it at, or may have been, depending if you were a little bit more on the conservative side. But that being said, the value was not there, or is not there. So the issue at hand is, how do we maneuver through it? Before the bank comes knocking at your door, my advice to anyone is see if you can sell. If you're really reaching the point where it's unsustainable, yes, you'd like to have your family in a certain type of home. You'd like, to keep your home. All of us would like to. But if it's unsustainable, really and truly, there is no point in maintaining it. And I think that is the issue at hand, is that people are trying to hold on to properties that are unsustainable, unaffordable. And where we're
Lots of
at
people,
is,
lots of people have been talking that we've got a real estate bubble. Is this the bubble burst? Are we in a real estate crash?
I believe we are. Yes, I believe we are. And there's a whole new cycle started. Part of that was the federal government's intention to allow for first-time home buyers to break into the market so it's affordable for them. But it was, I think, too far-reaching in the sense that this went on for too long. The rates remained high for far too long. And now we don't have enough buyers in the market, and the properties are sitting longer on the market as well. And so it's really the only parties that are profiting from this type of market are investors that are able to be private lenders or have the funds to capitalize on these properties that are at a significantly lower rate than previous years.
I think one of the things people got to do is have good legal advice as they're going through this process. Sarita, if people want to reach out to you, how do they best do that?
Yep, they can reach us at 647-748-1377 or sstlaw.ca.
Sarita, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's been a frank, a little bit depressing, but I think a conversation that a lot of us need to have. Really appreciate you giving us an overview of the market and what we got to do if we find ourselves in a difficult situation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I do think that we are in a down cycle. I'm not sure if it's a crash yet. It probably is. And I worry that if a lot of the things that Sarita and I have been talking about come true, the crash could be even worse as a lot of these people try to refinance, can't refinance. Take Sarita's advice, which is to sell, but then you got to sell into a down market, and that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, a vicious cycle. And so I worry, and I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are unable to close on these condos that these massive buildings that we see being completed around downtown Toronto that were all 70-80% purchased by small-time investors, and they've got to sometime in the next year come to the table with these mortgages that they're not going to be able to come to the table with. And so I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that's reality. And so therefore I think that Sarita's advice is pretty good. Anyway, that's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream online at www.saga960am.ca. My podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on YouTube, on podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. Sarita, always a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.